Well, last hour we looked at the story of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon and his experiences that he had and how God taught him. Finally, it'll lock up. There we go. God taught him those lessons. Remember the lessons? The God of the Hebrews is all-knowing, he's all-powerful, and he does his will, and that he's the Lord of all, and so the king accepted him as the Lord of all. That's the third lesson. But you know, the people who were there to help the king learn were the Hebrews. Now, why is it that the Hebrews were in Babylon? God used them there to witness for him, but the very fact that they were there was a sad story of history, wasn't it? Because God had taken the Hebrews and he put them in the land of Palestine, and that was a place that was central to the known world. If you came from the Orient, if you came from the Mediterranean and Europe area, if you came from Egypt, you had to travel through this area. It was in the middle. The trade routes all went through, and God placed them right in the center so they could be a witness. But then what happened? You know, it is the story of the Bible that God gives opportunities. He sets up things, and many times those that claim to be his people experience a failure. But through those that are willing, God still is glorified. And so those few captives went away. Their city was destroyed. And imagine they're there with King Nebuchadnezzar. And, who are you? Oh, I'm from Jerusalem. Oh, that place. That place where your king broke his promises. That place that's been rebellious against our government and that we had to go in there and destroy. Oh, that's where you're from. And we've heard of the God of that city whose temple was destroyed. Yes, it looks like your God hasn't been able to preserve you in the face of our more powerful armies. And these were the kind of challenges that they would face. And so Daniel is there. They try to change his name. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were known, but that was their Babylonian name, so they tried to change their name. They tried to change their religion. And so they actually served God under a great, let's say, not a very nice circumstances, very difficult circumstances. So today our theme is conflict and character. Their characters were tested. And so when they get to Babylon, we started this morning in chapter 2. But in chapter 1, this is what happened to Jerusalem in chapter 1 of Daniel, verses 1 and 2. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. So he broke in, captured the city, took the holy vessels and brought them to the treasure house of his God. It was a very sad day in Jerusalem, wasn't it? It was very hard, very sad. Now, Nebuchadnezzar showed his character, his magnanimity, that he spoke to the master of his eunuchs, in verses 3 to 5, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well-favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning and knowledge, and understanding in science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So when the king wanted some people from Jerusalem, he asked for royals, for princes, so these were people who were connected already with administration. He wanted them to be, it says, well-favored, skillful, wise. He wanted them already to be educated. Keep in mind that the education they received in Babylon was not from the ground up. They should already be knowledgeable. They should already be educated. And then they would teach them the particular learning and the language of the Chaldeans. And so they took what they thought were the best, and they brought them to Babylon. In God's providence, the ones that they took, they stood out, were these. From verses 6 and 7. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's their Hebrew names. You see their Babylonian names coming up, but these are their Hebrew names. And to whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, to Hananiah of Shadrach, to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. If you look at the meanings of those names, they have changed. Daniel is the suffix there, El, is the name of God, a title of God. And they change it to Belteshazzar. So that's of the god Bel. So when changing their names, they wanted to change their faith as well. Were they successful in doing that? You could change their location, you could change their circumstances, you could change even their names, but you couldn't change their character. You couldn't take away the character they had. And sometimes for all of us, we go through life in different situations. You may receive an economic setback that you don't have. You might lose a job, you might lose a position, you might have various things that happen to you in life. But whatever they can take away from you, even if your rights are removed from you, no one can take from you one thing. What is it? It's your character. Your character and your relationship with God. No one can take away from you, no matter what they do. Even they put you in prison for your faith. And some of us know people, personally, we know people who have been to prison not for doing wrong things, but for their faith. And no one could take that away from them. So these men were in that situation. Now, obviously they faced, very early on, they faced a test of character. And what was that very first test? In verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So very first test, they were placed there, and the king, of course, the king believed that he had all the best, and kings could afford all the best food. It's an interesting fact that everyone's heard of the Mediterranean diet, right? The Mediterranean diet's the diet that around the Mediterranean, people eat simple food. It's mostly plant-based, very, from the earth, natural. And what I read a few years ago was that the Mediterranean diet is disappearing in the Mediterranean. Because with increased prosperity, transportation, and development, those people can now get what they believe, they can, before they had what they had, what foods could grow locally, and now they can afford to get more from elsewhere. And so the Mediterranean diet is actually disappearing. When you can, you do. And of course, the king can afford anything. The king can afford to have any kind of food, so there was every delicacy there. Of course, there was things that the Hebrew boys were never used to eating. There were unclean meats, and they were wine and things that, all the different things that they weren't used to. And besides all of this, they had made a decision that they were actually following even a stricter diet beyond what was sort of required of the Hebrews. And because we find that in verses 11 to 14, then said to Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. So the decision was, what's going to be their diet? Plant foods. The pulses are beans, all right? But so vegetables and water, basically. But if you back up to verse 8, how did they come to this point? There's a very important word here. An important action that Daniel took. What action did Daniel take here in verse 8? Something did, a very important word. You see it? Yet not to defile. The action here, though, that Daniel did in himself, it says he purposed in his heart. So he understood the issue. Sometimes we'll say, we may face a situation and we say, well, we'll see what happens. Did Daniel say, well, we'll see what happens? No, it says he purposed in his heart. He made a decision. He purposed in his heart. And I believe, of course, that was with God's help. And he claimed God's promises. He purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. And so he asked to give pulse and water to drink. Now, that I'm shortening the story a little bit because there's a little bit more details to the story. But he asked for 10 days trial. Now, I'm not sure in 10 days how much diet will make a difference. Nevertheless, God's principles are such, and no doubt if the others who were introduced to this diet, they were maybe not used to such opulence, they could have as much as they wanted of anything they wanted. And who knows, maybe in those 10 days they all went overboard, right? Who knows? But whatever the case, God's blessing was on Daniel and his friends. And after 10 days, it says here in verse 15, 16, at the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine which they, food, it means, portion of their meat means food, and the wine which they should drink, and gave them pulse. That's beans, vegetables. Tell you what, I love beans. I could live on beans, but that means he gave them vegetarian food. So they had a vegetarian diet. Now, of course, they had that 3 years there in Babylon to learn the language and the system of the Chaldeans. And at the end of it, what was the result? At the end, verses 18 to 20, now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. I'm fascinated by the fact here that the king himself was the one who gave them their examination. So, what would you say about King Nebuchadnezzar? Was he an ignorant king? An ignorant despot? He was well educated himself. For him to actually be asking them the questions, he himself was very well educated. For him to personally examine them, he was a pretty smart person, and very intelligent, very well educated. And so he found them to be 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers. In Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, it says that God always honors the right. The most promising youth from all the lands subdued by the great conqueror had been gathered at Babylon, yet amid them all the Hebrew captives were without a rival. The erect form, the firm elastic step, the fair countenance, the undimmed senses, the untainted breath, all were so many certificates of good habits, insignia of the nobility with which nature honors those who are obedient to her laws. So the first test of character was a test in practical things. In fact, we just talked about the health camp. We talked about making good choices. That was the first thing they were tested on. What kind of choices will you make? Now just imagine if they had said, look, this is the king's table. He's not going to be happy if we don't accept his hospitality. We'd better just kind of go along with this. What could have happened there? Would we be even reading that story today? It may be that we wouldn't be reading this story if they'd have made a choice like that. So that was their very first test. Of course, we also looked at this one, and we looked at it from the perspective of the king. That the king learned when he threw the 3 boys in the fire that they couldn't be burned because their God was stronger. But for them, themselves, what kind of test was this for their character? Think about that. They themselves, their character was tested in a very dramatic and severe, that's a life and death situation. And we don't know how we will react. But character is tested in an emergency situation when perhaps even life is at stake. Character is tested. And they answered courageously. We read the verses this morning. That last part of verse 18, O king, we will not serve thy gods nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So character was tested for Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Contrast this, and also contrast the experience of Nebuchadnezzar, how he himself became converted, with his grandson, Belshazzar. Now we know that Belshazzar was actually not the sole ruler. His father was, and there's records now that we have records that have been uncovered documenting, sort of the Bible records something, but archaeology has to catch up sometimes to find the evidences. But over the years, we've found, yes, there's a Nabonidus, and he was off doing something somewhere else in the kingdom, and he left the city of Babylon for his son. So his son was effectively ruling there in Babylon. It opens up in Daniel chapter 5 that they're having a feast, they're drinking wine, and you would think it's just another day in Babylon. Except, do you know what was happening outside the city? The very night they're having a big feast and a big party inside. What's happening outside? That very night, the Medo-Persian army was there. They had been camped there for quite some time. They had been making great preparations. They had actually been working. Cyrus had set some of his soldiers to work, not with swords, but with shovels. They were preparing to divert the river. And when the river level goes down, they're going to march in under the protected gates, barriers where the river went under, and they were going to attempt to get inside the city. Inside of Babylon, they weren't getting ready for that. They were getting ready for a party. So that is the character of Belshazzar. You couldn't get any more difference in characters between, let's say, between Daniel and Belshazzar, could you? So very different in their choices and in their character. So here's Belshazzar. He's now effectively, he has the keys of the kingdom, the most powerful, second in charge, the most powerful person on earth, and effectively he's been left in charge. And now what's the best thing he can think of doing? While there's an army outside, enemies ready to capture the city, the best thing he can think is having a holiday and having a party. And so they did. Well, we know what happened. He's there drinking wine, and it says he had an idea. Daniel 5, this is verses 2-4. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem. Do you remember that? We read that a little bit earlier. So the holy sacred vessels from the temple, they've been put in the treasure house. Oh, let's bring those out and let's drink in them. Why did he do this? Why do you think he would have done this? Is it because he didn't have enough cups to drink out of? There was a special reason. It says that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. Think about this. What are they saying when they take the holy vessels from Jerusalem? Babylon is greater, and the gods of Babylon are greater. And even while the enemy is camped outside, they are so boastful to say, we are secure in here. Babylon is great, and we can even mock the God of the Hebrews, whose city we destroyed. Now, it would be one thing if he was ignorant. Was Belshazzar ignorant of the God of heaven? Was he ignorant of the stories of his grandfather? Did he not know? He knew all those things. And so verse 5 says, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed. Normally you read that when it comes to someone's very upset with someone else. This is their countenance. You ever had that? When someone's countenance is changed toward you, all of a sudden they don't look at you the same anymore. Well, in this case, his countenance was changed because his conscience now was smiting him, as we say. His thoughts troubled him, so the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. I don't think I've ever seen anyone so afraid that they're sitting there and their knees are knocking. But that's what happened. He really understood this was an omen of fear, right? And of course, again, who did they call? All the same wise men as before. No success. So then I think it was the queen mother came in. She was not at the party because it says she came because of the commotion. She heard the commotion, and who knows who she was, but she could have been, who knows, she could have been the wife of Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know. But it says the queen came in. So that's why I would say the queen mother, whether she was Belshazzar's queen or whether she was from the prior generations. But she came in. So then it says they called Daniel. She said, there's someone who can help you. It's Daniel. At least somebody. She was, first of all, she was sober. Okay, she wasn't involved in the party. And she was thinking about the history and things. You need to call Daniel. Bring Daniel here. Then it says, so then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. Interesting. Verse 15, Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing, and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. He was not ignorant of Daniel, and he calls Daniel in kind of after being compelled to do so. And notice what he promises him. Some rewards there, and it says shall be the third ruler of the kingdom. And this is another evidence that he was not the third ruler. He couldn't make him the second in charge. Why not? He was second in charge. So as the second in charge, what's the best he can do? Third ruler. Now, of course, Daniel said, Let thy gifts be to thyself and give thy rewards to another. Daniel was not interested in the rewards of the king, yet will I read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. Then he goes through, I know it's quite a few verses, I might just skip a little bit here, but it says, O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And verse 20, But when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses, and they fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. You see, he learned who is the one that's the overruling ruler on this earth. And Nebuchadnezzar understood that, which is interesting because Belshazzar's denying this, isn't he? Belshazzar is saying the opposite. This is great city of Babylon. We can even mock the God of the Hebrews. And even though the army is camped outside, this city will stand forever. So then he says, And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. You see, this is the key point here. Was he ignorant of all of this history? He understood it all. He knew it all. He knew it. And he says, And you have not humbled your heart. Verse 23, But hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. This was the last straw, the last act of Babylon before its fall. And you think about this, there's a principle here which for individuals and for nations holds true. People many times do things not knowing, not realizing. So Nebuchadnezzar came in, besieged Jerusalem, took the city, took the treasures from the house of Jerusalem, put them in his own treasure house and said, I'm the chief here, right? But he did so not knowing who he is fighting against. And God strove with him, and so after those 3 lessons of the king, he learned, he understood, and he submitted himself to the God of heaven. Belshazzar, in what he did, kind of similar, but he did it knowing better. And that's a difference. And what did he do here? It's basically when essentially the sovereign of this kingdom, Babylon, creates a religious, a worship exercise in opposition to God. Knowingly doing that. Knowingly, blaspheming the God of heaven and exalting themselves. So that's kind of a principle that we find in history and in prophecy. Remember, there was Herod the king who had, actually, for political reasons, he had persecuted the Christians, and all of that added to his guilt until one day he was making a speech, and people said, wow, that's like the voice of a god. And he accepted that adoration, and what happened? Instantly, he was eaten up with worms. He right there on the stage, he realized something was wrong, and he died an agonizing death. And what was it? When he blasphemed God, he took glory to himself knowingly, and that was the last straw for him. So that was the same thing here. And of course, what was written on the wall? On the wall it said, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. So this is the interpretation. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, which is like a shekel. So it's a reference to weights and measures and money and so forth. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. And Perez, or upharsin, it's actually Farsi, still around today. That's the language of the Persians. So Farsi or Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That was the message. So that was the last thing. Of course, the king followed through. He had promised Daniel to be clothed in scarlet with a golden chain and a proclamation that he was the third ruler. And then it just says in verse 30 that in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. Well, what was happening right then? Outside the city, the armies of Cyrus had diverted the river, so the river level had gone down. There was part of the city on both sides of the river, and there was a wall across with metal grates actually penetrating into the surface of the water, so you couldn't very easily get a whole army of people through there. Even if you managed to get some people through, lining the river was another wall. And along the riverbank, this wall goes, and then at some point there are gates, and there's a bridge across the wall, and I understand there was even a tunnel underneath. But those gates on the inside could be locked, closed off, and so even if you got into the river, you would have had to still get through these big, heavy gates. Well, guess what? On the night of the party, guess what? Babylon will stand forever, and so they left the gates open. So as they were having this very conversation, no doubt the footsteps of the Persian soldiers were marching down the banks of the river. They found the gates open. They probably found that the guards had been drinking with everyone else. And so they walked in virtually unopposed, and they took the city of Babylon just like that. So it says, that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So that's how Daniel, of course, gets into the next kingdom, Medo-Persia. But I thought it was really interesting, the contrast between the two characters, or the Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Belshazzar. And so we find when we study the prophecies, there are the lessons here. The lesson is, what kind of character will we be developing? What kind of choices will we make? And what kind of character are we demonstrating when it comes to our own lives, and especially as we look at prophecy? We look at where we are in the scheme of time. You and I may face character tests like this. Maybe something different decision, but the question is the same. Will you do what is right, or will you do what is convenient? What is easy? What is the easier path? The more popular path, or will you do what is right? Well, Daniel gets to Persia, and again, I want to review the story, but try to speed it up a little bit here. Daniel, usually, how we have elections in Australia, and we have a change of government, and all of the cabinet from the previous one, of course, they're all out, and so it's all new people in. Well, new empire now, because Babylon is conquered, so that was the stronghold of the Babylonian Empire, now becomes part of Persia, but yet they want Daniel in their kingdom. I think that's a mark of a good character. The opposition still wants him, okay? So the Babylonians had him, but now the Persians said, no, we want this guy too. He was well known. Must have been well known. Verses 1-3, please Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was the first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and that the king should have no damage. Now, look very carefully here. What is Daniel's purpose here in Persia, in the Medo-Persian kingdom? Very important role. The princes were to give accounts to Daniel, and Daniel is to check So the king has what? No damage. He's not shortchanged. It's well known that the process of collecting the tribute, that's the money that comes from all the provinces to the king's income to the kingdom, that was a very corrupt process. And so, it's filling your own pocket and paying off other people while you're giving some to the king. And so if you could find someone who was eminently honest, you'd put them at the top of that organization, wouldn't you? And so he did. It says, this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. So the king said, this guy's actually good. You know what? I'm going to put him right at the top, actually. Well, what was the reaction to this? It says, then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Can you imagine at work, at your place of employment, can you imagine being under that level of scrutiny? That there are people who want your job, and they are looking for any mistake. And whatever they will make the most out of it that they can. They're looking for even genuine mistakes. Just anything. They're looking for anything. They're all out to get you. Imagine being under that kind of scrutiny. And could they find anything? What could they find against Daniel? So he was not only honest and conscientious when it comes to faith, he was a very reliable, disciplined, and conscientious worker in his work, what he was doing for the king, which is quite an inspiration, isn't it? So then, what did they decide next? They actually take Daniel's honest, reliable character and they turn it against him. Well, they say, Daniel will never compromise when it comes to his God, so we can use that against him. Isn't that interesting? He was so predictable, so reliable, so honest and conscientious in his worship of God. They said, these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Of course, what do? You know the story. They decide they will trick the king into making a law that no one can pray to any god except the king for 30 days. And, of course, this plays on the king's pride, doesn't it? The king is not a character like Daniel. So Daniel has a much more noble character than the king, for sure. And so the king doesn't even think, sure, you want to do... he was very flattered, and he went right along with that. Okay, so the law was signed, no praying to anyone. What does Daniel do? Daniel does not change his behavior. It says, when he knew the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. So he knew the law was created. He could have found a better place to pray that was more private, and nope, but he didn't even, this is interesting to me, he didn't even change his behavior. He didn't change anything. He knew he was under scrutiny. Do you think Daniel understood that? I think he did. He knew this is showdown time. He knew his life is at risk. And he went there and he prayed just like he did before. And so this is an interesting thing because now a law is made against Daniel. And we have that, another example in the book of Esther. A law is made against God's people. And in prophecy, there's another one which someone's going to be presenting to us in the workshops this week, Revelation 13. And there is a law against people who worship God. So this is a good time for us to think about the fact that you and I may face something like that. Not only it's sort of consequentially affects us. We had a few years ago, we had some shutdowns and lockdowns that, we had to close churches, and that was really upsetting and concerning. But we're talking a step beyond that. We're not talking about something that affected everyone. We're talking about something directed against Daniel himself because of his following God. You see? And so we expect that in Revelation chapter 13, which we'll get there. But in Revelation chapter 13, as students of prophecy, it says it very specifically becomes directed against people who worship God. And so that's what Daniel faced. Well, he went and he prayed anyway. How long did it take to lay charges against Daniel based on the law? I reckon it was the same day. They couldn't wait to get rid of him. They went and laid charges based on the law. And it's verses 11 to 13. They remind the king, and the king was very upset with himself. He regretted letting his ego get the better of him and not realize what he was doing. But it's a feature of the law of the Medes and Persians. What is it? When the law is made, what is unique about the law of Medes and Persians of that time? Once a law is made and put under the royal seal, what happens after that? You can't change it. So even in time of Esther, they had to issue a new law which kind of undid the effect of the old one. You can't repeal a law, basically. Which, when you study, I've just got my books, but the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem, it's interesting that God uses that to advantage later on. That's a very interesting part of the story, which hopefully you get a chance to look into when you get that book. One of the 2 books I held up this morning. But here, so the law couldn't be changed. So finally, it says that the king, in verse 14, he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. He must have tried every legal argument. When there was none, the king turns to Daniel. Well, he commands, and they brought Daniel, cast him into the den of lions. And now the king spake and said to Daniel, Thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. That's basically saying you can prove that he never got out of there. They chucked him in, he never came out, that was the end. At least some people thought. You know the story though, right? The king stayed awake all night. Very early in the morning, he went and he called out, Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? And my favorite part of this chapter is this. Then said Daniel to the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. Forasmuch as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Daniel points out that he has actually done nothing wrong. So he brought him up, and the king was glad. It says, commanded that they should bring him up. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. Another test of character. And Daniel was protected. God protected him. And so, just like the Jews in time of Esther were protected, Daniel was protected through this threat. And the threat of death that was made to Daniel came back to who? You know, just in case you thought it was just a fluke, the lions weren't hungry that day. In verse 24, the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them and their children and their wives. And the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. Which is quite a gruesome verse to read. Nevertheless, you can't say that the lions weren't hungry, and that somehow there was some kind of way that Daniel just escaped, some shenanigans there. It was very obvious. And so the king said this, He delivereth and rescueth and worketh signs and wonders in heaven and earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Amazing. The showdowns between right and wrong, between good character and intemperate and bad character are all there. So these are lessons. Now that's the end of Daniel chapter 6. And so as you read further in Daniel, you get to the visions of Daniel, of course, all the symbols and all the prophecies there. But I wanted to point out and just share together these stories to understand that the story itself is important. The lessons here are important for us, not just what's in the prophecies. And sometimes people the motivation is to find something new, to find something, sensational in the prophecies. And however, some of these stories, we know the stories. Well, do we know the lessons from the stories? Now, in just a couple of more minutes, I would like to share just something about the author of the book of Revelation. Because John was one of the 12 disciples. And together with his brother James, who was by the way, the first martyr. So you have James was the first martyr, and John died of natural causes as the last of the disciples, other than Judas, different story. But of the faithful 12, James was the first, and John was last. And but it's interesting, both of them had one thing in common. What was it? Besides that they come from the same family, Jesus gave them a name, which I think was interesting. You know, they were known as the sons of thunder, but who gave them that name? Jesus did. He called them that. Oh, you sons of thunder. Yeah. So Jesus actually gave them that Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder. But they became, from sons of thunder, they became the brave, courageous James and indeed the courageous John, who they took that courage, that energy, and they turned it into something else. Now, John actually became known as a name. In the book of John, you'll find a few times, he's mentioned but not by name. So he writes about himself, and what is the nickname or the code name that he's known by? Do you know? It says here in the verses, then Peter turning about, seeth the disciple whom Jesus loved following. Isn't that nice, though? He became to be known as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, just stopping for a minute. Doesn't Jesus love everyone? And wouldn't Jesus love everyone equally? Would Jesus pick favorites? So how could John become known as the disciple whom Jesus loved? How could that be? What do you think? Doesn't Jesus love them all? I believe he does. But think about this. He was one who listened. Kind of, you could say, like Mary. Remember? When Martha was busy getting, being hospitable, which was a good thing, but Mary was listening to what Jesus said. And because she was listening, she understood something. Because that was her character, her character was to really hang off every word of Jesus. She was listening and she caught something that other people didn't recognize, didn't notice. And so that's why she came and actually anointed Jesus' feet, because she heard him say that he was going to die. And she came to anoint him. And you know what? Of all the disciples, who's the one that got to anoint Jesus' body? It was her. Because you remember, the other ones came back early on the morning of the first day of the week. They brought spices and they brought it to the tomb. And what did they find? Oh, he's gone. He's already resurrected. So she was one who listened. And so I think that John was like that. He was one who listened, who came closer to the Lord. So when it says that Jesus loved him, Jesus loves all. But the closer you can come to him, the closer he can come to you. And so you and I have this is not like John was some unique person that he's the only one that can be like this. All of us have the opportunity to be the one who Jesus loves. The closer you come to him, the closer he can come to you. So Peter, this is now Jesus walking along the beach with Peter and telling Peter how he was going to end up. He said, someone will carry you and stretch out your arms. And so Peter understood how he would die. He would be crucified. And so that's the story of Peter. But he turns around and there's John walking behind, the one who Jesus loved. And he said, Lord, let me read it properly. Then Peter, turning about, seeth the disciple whom Jesus loved following, which also leaned on his breast at supper, and saith, Lord, which is he that betrayeth thee? Peter, seeing him, saith to Jesus, Lord, and what shall this man do? So Peter turns around, he sees John. Well, what will happen to him? Jesus saith unto him, If I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Follow thou me. Peter, if I want him to live until my coming, that's my business. So then it says, Then went this saying abroad among the brethren, that disciple should not die. They all said, oh, John's going to live all the way through till the Lord comes again, right? Yet Jesus said not unto him, He shall not die, but if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? This is the disciple which testifieth of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. That was John. So he wrote the Gospel of John, But his story in Revelation, he says, I, John, who also am your brother and companion in tribulation and in the kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ, was in the isle that is called Patmos for the word of God and for the testimony of Jesus Christ. Why was he there on the island of Patmos? Do you know what he had to do to get there? There was John. He was not afraid of God's word. He went from son of thunder to the one who Jesus loved, to a fearless preacher of the gospel, and they tried to get rid of him. They tried in different ways, including throwing him into a vat of boiling oil. So he was literally going to be deep fried. He wouldn't die. And finally they were afraid, and so they took him away, and they said, look, we can't get rid of this man, so let's banish him out to an island. So we have this island called Patmos. We're going to stick him out there so he can't preach to anybody anymore. But you know, that was where he did his best work from there on. And that's where we have the book of Revelation and the Gospel of John. Both came from him there on that island of Patmos. So we can be grateful that he was sent out there to live on the island in the middle of the sea, the Mediterranean, just off the coast of what is today Turkey, what was known as Asia Minor. And it's interesting that he sat there. I can imagine him sitting on the rocks and looking toward the coast of Asia Minor. And if his vision were good enough, like if he had built-in telescopes, he could have seen the 7 churches that were in the 7 cities around in a circle there in Asia Minor, and he wrote a letter to them, and you find those letters in Revelation. In the Acts of the Apostles, it says, Patmos, a barren rocky island in the Aegean Sea, had been chosen by the Roman government as a place of banishment for criminals. But to the servant of God, this gloomy abode became the gate of heaven. Here, shut away from the busy scenes of life and from the active labors of former years, he had the companionship of God in Christ and the heavenly angels. And from them he received instruction for the church for all future time. The letters written, by the way, is written not just for those people. They're written for us. In fact, more for us than for them. The events that would take place in the closing scenes of this earth's history were outlined before him, and there he wrote out the visions he received from God. When his voice could no longer testify to the one whom he loved and served, the messages given him on that barren coast were to go forth as a lamp that burneth, declaring the sure purpose of the Lord concerning every nation on the earth. Do you know? That's the last word from God in the Bible to do with the events of earth. Those were the last words. And those prophecies take us right down to today and into future. And so it literally is our map going from the past into the future for us even today. And there are things in the book that he wrote are being fulfilled as we speak. So this is the story of Daniel and a little bit of the story of John. And I'm really excited to look at what they wrote. But today I'd just like to come back to a point about our mission today, because here was Daniel, and at the end of the book, Daniel is told to finish writing his book, to seal it up, and to let it sit there, for it will be for many days. But Daniel, all along, there were things he understood, and there were some things he didn't understand that he wanted to understand. Don't you think he would love to be alive today? Don't you think Daniel would love to be alive when the things that he saw in his visions would actually come to pass? Do you think he would love to see the time when Michael the Prince stands up, when the saints are delivered, when judgment is pronounced on the beast, and Jesus takes the kingdom, and it says the saints take the kingdom and possess it forever? Don't you think he would love to be there and see that? And yet he's resting. And the same for John. John had the vision to look into heaven. He could see the experience of God's people in the last days. He took in his vision, he took the little book that was sweet in his mouth and bitter in his stomach. And then the angel says, you must prophesy again. And don't you think that John would like to see that message go forward? That loud cry of the third angel. So all of these things they would have loved to look into, and yet they're resting. But they're for us today. So what is our mission? Education says on page 262 and 263, God's purpose for the children growing up beside our hearths is wider, deeper, higher than our restricted vision has comprehended. From the humblest lot, those whom he has seen faithful have in time past been called to witness for him in the world's highest places. And many a lad of today, growing up as did Daniel in his Judean home, studying God's word and his works, and learning the lessons of faithful service, will yet stand in legislative assemblies, in halls of justice, or in royal courts as a witness for the King of Kings. That is yet to come. And so little children growing up in our homes today, learning God's word, learning simple lessons of doing a good job, doing it with energy, finishing the work you started, being obedient, being punctual, neat, and being considerate and courteous and kind, all of those lessons will yet prepare someone in future to stand in front of the Prime Minister of Australia, the Parliament, maybe the King, maybe the U.S. Congress or the President. Even yet, there will be those who will give witness to their faith, like Daniel, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, like Esther. They will give witness to their faith. Multitudes will be called to a wider ministry. The whole world is opening to the gospel. Ethiopia is stretching out her hands unto God. From Japan and China and India, from the still darkened lands of our own continent, from every quarter of this world of ours comes the cry of sin-stricken hearts for a knowledge of the God of love. Millions upon millions have never so much as heard of God or of his love revealed in Christ. It is their right to receive this knowledge. They have an equal claim with us in the Savior's mercy, and it rests with us who have received the knowledge, with our children to whom we may impart it, to answer their cry. To every household and every school, to every parent, teacher, and child upon whom this has shown the light of the gospel, comes at this crisis the question put to Esther the queen at that momentous crisis in Israel's history: who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And that's why together with the board of Elam Missionary College, we decided to put out this program here that we're doing, not just for a few days here for us, but we're preparing material that you can use, participants can use, and we're preparing something that will have a life, hopefully, going forward to help us be familiar with the prophecies, with the character lessons, and being prepared to share it with other people, because who knows which of us will be standing there before kings and before presidents and before politicians to give witness to our faith, before judges and so forth. And so, we want to find, as the spotlight shines through history and prophecy, we want to find that story and how it relates to the remnant. Revelation 14:12 says, "Here is the patience of the saints, here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." And so, we want to be those people, and we want to look for them in history as we study together. That brings us to the end of presentation number 2. For those that want to stick around and do the whole program, we will share a little bit more at 5 o'clock today. We will be sharing some, let me see, what is it going to be? So, introduction to prophecy, interpretation, meaning of symbols, and we will actually take the time to explain day for a year and how that's interpreted as well, some of the research that I've done and explaining why it is we use day for a year principle. All those things will be shared at 5 p.m. today. Hopefully we can take a little nature walk between now and then for those that are interested. I understand the choir also has a brief practice after we finish. So I hope to see you all at least at some of the presentations. And for those that sign up to do the whole thing, I look forward to sharing a little bit more with you at 5 o'clock. In the meantime, why don't we sing a song? And I think I picked number 440.